On December 29th, 1972, at 9:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Eastern Airlines flights EA-401 departed from JFK Airport in New York with a final destination of Miami, Florida. The plane was carrying 163 passengers and was being piloted by Captain Bob Loft. As the plane began its final descent into Miami, Captain Loft noticed that the landing gear lights were not turning on. As the crew tried to determine why the light was not coming on, tragically, they accidentally bumped the control yoke, which disengaged the autopilot. This action led to the plane slowly descending and ultimately crashing into the Florida Everglades. Sadly, 5 crew members and 96 passengers would perish, while 75 people survived. While the story of this disaster initially seemed to end here, it did not. In the months and years following the event, there were multiple reports of paranormal activity involving sightings of crew who died that day. There's been much speculation over the years surrounding these strange events. In this episode, we will examine the paranormal activity and stories surrounding Eastern Airlines Flight 401. In the minutes after the crash, brave flight attendants comforted surviving passengers in the pitch-black night by having individuals sing Christmas carols. The scene was frightening, as the survivors had no flashlights and matches couldn't be lit because of all the spilled gasoline. Soon the rescuers would arrive and find the remaining passengers. Of the survivors, many were badly injured, while others would die later in the hospital. In the ensuing days and weeks, as crews began to clean up wreckage from the crashed aircraft, Eastern Airlines would salvage many pieces from the downed airplane. In the weeks and months that followed, many of these parts were repurposed and used for other planes. However, as these parts were integrated into other airplanes, strange reports of paranormal activity, especially around Captain Bob Loft and flight engineer Don Repo, would be reported. One of the most notable encounters occurred when an Eastern Airlines executive reported to spot Bob Loft. As the executive was boarding the empty plane, he noticed an Eastern Airlines employee sitting in one of the passenger seats. The executive began speaking to the captain, but soon came to the stunning realization the man was Captain Bob Loft. The executive quickly fled the plane, alerting crew and others. The crew re-entered the plane, but as they came on in, the captain was not on board. The executive was convinced this was a horrible omen, and there was even discussion of canceling the flight. However, that didn't happen, and the flight would land safely. Perhaps one of the most famous incidents involves a flight attendant and her horrifying experience. The flight was traveling the same route Bob had crashed on, and as the attendant was checking the overhead bins, she stated she opened one to find Bob's severed head staring at her. The ghost of flight engineer Don Repo was also spotted several times too by Eastern Airlines employees. Similar to today, flight engineers boarded planes early on to perform pre-flight checks. On one occasion, an Eastern Airlines engineer entered the cockpit and saw someone sitting in his seat. The engineer would recognize him as Don Repo. Repo then turned around and told the engineer that he had done the checks and everything was good. On a different flight, another flight headed from JFK toward Mexico City, a flight attendant reported to be looking at a glass door when she would be horrified to see Don's face. She quickly grabbed 2 other flight attendants, and then according to the report, Don said to them, "Watch out for fire in this plane." Eerily, on the return flight back to JFK, an engine on the plane had to be shut down very early in the flight. Experts say if it hadn't been turned off, it would have caught fire. The plane was forced to return to Mexico City shortly after taking off. Passengers also reported seeing a strange pilot several times. On one occasion, a passenger reported sitting next to a pale, sick-looking pilot. The passenger went and grabbed some crew members, and when they returned, the captain had vanished. Another passenger would report a similar incident with an unresponsive pilot who disappeared without a trace. It's reported both travelers were shown a picture of Don Repo, and both confirmed that was who they saw. On one other occasion, a pilot would allege to see Don's face. Don would apparently say, "There will never be another crash on an L1011. We will not let it happen." Another encounter of Don would occur as well during a trip. In mid-flight inside the cockpit, the crew would hear banging below the floor. A stunned crew opened the hatch and would be shocked to see Don Repo. On the night of the crash, this was the area that Don was killed during impact. Officially, Eastern Airlines never admitted the paranormal activity happening on their flights. Unofficially, though, it appeared to be a different story. It said many crew members were terrified after the Mexico City incident, and many refused to fly on planes that had parts salvaged from the wrecked plane. The request got to be so high, in fact, that Eastern Airlines began actively removing Flight 401 parts from planes. Still, the company denied any ghost sightings on their planes. It's documented as well that the company threatened to fire any employee who discussed ghost stories. Then CEO Frank Borman called the stories garbage. In the years since the crash, there's been numerous books, movies, and TV shows around it and the supernatural activity that occurred. Still, there appears to be a good number of skeptics who question the reports. With so many happening, though, it seems that something was happening on these planes. Something paranormal in nature. That said, it seems likely that some of these stories were either fabricated or possibly imagined. Perhaps as the stories began, people were looking for something not there. Still, it should be said, due to the threats by management, there could have been more incidents not reported. Also, there were numerous reports with multiple witnesses. In some, it appears these events, which did stop over time, more than likely happened. It's long been thought that individuals who suffer a traumatic death often have issues moving on to the next life. Were Repo and Loft stuck and unable to move on for some time? Perhaps the guilt compelled them to stay behind and ensure no other planes crashed. If this was the case, it appears they were successful. No other plane would ever crash in Eastern Airlines history. Let's hope Repo and Loft were able to move on and finally rest in peace.